Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues in discussing the single greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States for the next century, and that is the rise of Communist China. We are right now months into a deadly global pandemic that has sickened over 14 million people worldwide and has taken the lives of over 600,000 people. And why are we in the midst of a global pandemic? Because the Chinese Communist Party deliberately lied to the world, covered up the outbreak, and allowed it to spread. The coronavirus pandemic has thrown into high relief the fact that China is our most dangerous threat. For 8 years in the U.S. Senate, I have worked hard to lead the fight to address the threat of Chinese communist power and aggression and hostility head on. To make the United States economy as free and independent from China as possible, and to thwart the never-ending propaganda and censorship campaign from the Chinese communists. Last week, the Chinese Communist government made the decision to sanction me personally. So I am now, I awoke to discover, prohibited from traveling to Communist China. Somehow I think I will overcome that great burden. And I will tell you, I wear China's sanction as a badge of honor. There's a reason they're lashing out. There's a reason they have decided to direct personal sanctions on me, because they are scared, they are terrified. The Chinese communists are murdering, lying, torturing tyrants. For a long time in Washington, there were politicians in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, who were apologists for China, who denied the threat was there, who insisted that the path forward was getting more and more and more in bed with the Chinese communists. Well, the most significant long-term foreign policy consequence of this global pandemic is people's eyes are opening up on both sides of the aisle here in Washington and across the world. One need look no further than the United Kingdom reversing its decision to allow Huawei to build their telecom infrastructure to understand how China's mendacity has been revealed to the world. So how do we hold China accountable? How do we deal with the Chinese Communist Party? First of all, we should sanction Chinese officials involved in the ongoing suppression of medical experts, of journalists, and political dissidents, all of whom have been disappeared by the Chinese tyrants. I've introduced legislation to do just that. And over the past several years, I've introduced roughly a dozen separate pieces of legislation, all focused on different aspects of addressing the China threat. Another aspect is Chinese propaganda that is reflected here in the United States. Big business, giant corporations, the media, Hollywood, all are terrified to take on Communist China. All see the billions they can earn from access to the Chinese markets as more important than free speech. With respect to Hollywood, sadly, too many movie producers here in the United States have been perfectly content to allow the Chinese communists to censor American movies. So, for example, later this year, the sequel to Top Gun is scheduled to come out. Top Gun, one of the greatest military recruiting films ever made. Well, the sequel now, on Maverick's bomber jacket on the back, the flag of Taiwan has been removed. And the flag of Japan, both the Chinese overlords deemed offensive. And our heroic First Amendment champions in Hollywood dutifully complied with censorship. By the way, it needn't just concern geopolitical affairs in Asia. Another Hollywood movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, a fabulous biopic of Freddie Mercury, the lead singer for Queen. The Chinese censors decided it offended their sensibilities to have scenes in the movie that revealed that Freddie Mercury was homosexual. Now, I ask you to pause for a second and ask, how on earth do you tell Freddie Mercury's life story without including the fact that he was gay? It was integral to who he was. And yet Hollywood, who on so many other issues are glad to be woke social justice warriors, dutifully complied when the Chinese censors said, take it out, and they deleted the scenes from Bohemian Rhapsody. Well, I've introduced legislation in this body called the Script Act that will impose consequences when American companies allow the Chinese government to censor our films. The consequences are simple. We don't have the power as the government to impose direct negative consequences. But what we do have the power to do is use the incentives we have, namely, lots of movies borrow federal assets. You go watch a movie and you see a plane or a ship or a tank. You go watch a movie that's on the border and you see DHS assets. All sorts of federal agencies allow movies to use equipment that is the property of the federal government. The Script Act is very simple. It says if you're going to allow the Chinese communists to censor your movie, the federal government is not going to loan you our equipment and materiel. We're not going to facilitate making a movie if you're going to give the Chinese communists the editing and censoring pen. Not only do the Chinese communists engage in propaganda in Hollywood, they also engage in espionage and propaganda on our university campuses, a very deliberate, systematic effort to steal and deceive. In the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, I was proud to secure a funding prohibition for the Department of Defense from funding universities where the money could go to a Confucius Institute. As a result of that bipartisan legislation that earned support from Republicans and Democrats, 17 Confucius Institutes have been shut down. When it comes to our supply chain, we have seen in recent months the incredible foolishness of allowing the American supply chain to be dependent on China. Medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, PPE. In the midst of this pandemic, one Chinese government state-controlled newspaper explicitly threatened to cut off life-saving pharmaceuticals to the United States of America as a tool of economic warfare. Well, Mr. President, to do that, that wouldn't just be economic warfare, that would be actual warfare that is literally threatening the lives of millions of Americans. We need to break our supply chain dependence on China, especially concerning critical infrastructure, and I've introduced a host of legislation designed to do so with respect to pharmaceuticals, with respect to critical minerals. We have to keep the American people's lives and safety not dependent upon the whims of communist China. And a final point right now. In China today, there are roughly 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. An Orwellian-style dystopian government where the government has all power to monitor what you say, to monitor who you talk to monitor your beliefs. And I introduced legislation to impose sanctions on any American technology companies that facilitate the monitoring and oppression of the Chinese people. And I'm proud to say the Trump administration took major portions of that legislation I introduced and implemented it to increase the pressure to stop facilitating Chinese torture and oppression. The overwhelming challenge for this body and for this country for the next century going forward is how we stand up to the threat of China. China is waging a 1,000-year war. And for the sake, not only of Americans, but for the sake of the free world, America needs to win this contest. I yield the floor.